You lost, Grandpa. The voice carried across the operations lounge with the sharp confidence of a man who had never once doubted his place in the world. A few Delta operators looked up from their coffee cups and laptops, smirking as the old man slowly maneuvered his wheelchair past the security checkpoint. Fort Liberty's restricted operations wing hummed with low conversation, radio chatter, and the distant rumble of helicopters somewhere beyond the reinforced concrete walls. But for a moment, the room's attention shifted entirely toward the elderly stranger in the faded green field jacket. Walter Hayes didn't answer. At 84 years old, silence had become more comfortable than explanations. His weathered hands rested calmly on the worn rubber wheels of his chair, veins standing out beneath pale skin marked by age and old scars. A steel cane was clipped neatly along the side of the chair beside a folded wool blanket that looked older than some of the men staring at him. One of the younger operators leaned back in his seat near the wall-mounted mission displays and exchanged a grin with the others. "Sir, this area is restricted," Staff Sergeant Mason Reed said as he approached, his polished boots stopping directly in front of the wheelchair. He was 31, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed, carrying the effortless swagger of someone selected into one of the most elite units in the world. The subdued Delta patch on his sleeve blended into the dark tactical fabric, but he wore it with the unmistakable pride of a man who knew exactly what it meant. Walter slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Pale blue, calm, unreadable, the kind of eyes that seemed to absorb noise instead of reacting to it. Mason folded his arms. Visitor centers 2 buildings over. Unless you're here looking for bingo night. A few scattered laughs rolled through the lounge. Near the far wall, 2 operators stopped their conversation long enough to watch. Someone muttered, "Probably another retired contractor who got lost." Walter's gaze drifted past Mason without a word. Beyond the younger operator, mounted high against the concrete wall beneath soft recessed lights, hung a long black memorial plaque etched with rows of old call signs. Some polished bright from years of cleaning. Others faded with time. The old man stared at it quietly, his expression unchanged, but something in the room shifted ever so slightly. Mason noticed the stare and glanced back toward the wall. "You know somebody up there?" he asked, still carrying that mocking edge. Walter didn't blink. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee, machine oil, and rain drifting in from the flight line outside. Somewhere down the hall, a pair of boots moved quickly across polished concrete. The low static crackle of encrypted radios drifted in and out beneath the steady hum of fluorescent lights. The operations lounge was built for speed, precision, and warfighters at the peak of their careers. And right in the center of it sat an old disabled veteran in a faded jacket that looked like it belonged in another century. Mason crouched slightly to meet him eye level, amused now that the old man still hadn't answered. "You deaf too, Grandpa?" he asked. "Or just stubborn?" Walter finally shifted his attention back toward him. His voice, when it came, was low and rough like gravel dragged across cold steel. "Neither." The answer was calm, almost weightless. Yet several of the older operators nearby instinctively stopped moving. Mason smirked. "All right then," he said, straightening up. "Let's try this another way." He pointed toward the mission wall behind him, where old operation names and retired call signs rested beneath soft overhead light. "What unit were you with?" Walter said nothing. Mason chuckled softly and looked around the room for support. "No unit?" he asked. "Okay, then what was your call sign?" Mason Reed waited with a crooked grin stretched across his face, one hand hooked casually through the front of his tactical vest while the operations lounge settled into an uneasy silence around him. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Several younger operators leaned back in their chairs, anticipating either confusion or some rambling story from the old man in the wheelchair. Walter Hayes simply looked at him, calm, unmoving. The overhead lights reflected faintly in his pale blue eyes, but there was no embarrassment there, no uncertainty, just a stillness so complete it felt strangely out of place inside a room built around speed and aggression. Mason chuckled softly when no answer came. "What happened?" he asked. "You forgot it." Another ripple of laughter moved through the room. Someone near the coffee station muttered, "Maybe he was a supply clerk." Another voice answered, "No, look at the jacket. Probably motor pool." Walter slowly turned his attention back toward the memorial wall. Rows of faded call signs rested beneath framed photographs of operators long retired or long buried. Some names were legendary inside certain circles. Others had disappeared into classified history decades ago. The old man studied them quietly, as if searching for ghosts only he could still see. Mason followed his gaze and smirked. "You know," he said, "around here people earn those names." He tapped the patch on his own sleeve. "Nobody gets remembered for sitting around." The room gave another low laugh, but weaker this time. One of the older operators near the back shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Walter's hands rested loosely against the wheels of the chair, fingers scarred and worn from a lifetime of work that no longer showed itself through muscle. Outside the reinforced windows, rain tapped softly against the glass overlooking the distant flight line. The low hum of helicopter rotors rolled faintly through the concrete structure like distant thunder. Somewhere deeper inside the building, an encrypted radio chirped once before going silent again. Mason crouched slightly once more, lowering his voice with exaggerated patience. "Come on, old-timer," he said. Everybody had one. Ranger call signs. Pilot call signs. Team names. What was yours? Walter inhaled slowly through his nose. The sound was almost lost beneath the mechanical hum of the operations center around them. For a moment, it seemed like he might ignore the question entirely. Then his eyes drifted toward a small brass plaque mounted beside the memorial wall. One particular name sat engraved near the center. Daniel Mercer, killed during a classified operation 39 years earlier. Walter stared at it for several long seconds. Something deep behind his eyes shifted. Not anger, not fear. Memory. Cold mountain air. Rotor wash hammering through darkness. Frozen radio static cutting through the night. Men calling for extraction and voices trying desperately not to panic. The scent of aviation fuel mixing with snow and wet steel. Then the memory vanished. Walter finally spoke. His voice was rough and quiet enough that several people leaned forward to hear it clearly. Titan 3. The room stopped breathing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a sudden absence of motion. A chair creaked near the back wall. One operator lowered his coffee cup halfway to the table and froze there. Another slowly looked up from his laptop screen. Mason blinked once, confused by the sudden shift around him. Titan 3, he repeated with a short laugh. What kind of call sign is that? Nobody answered him. Near the far side of the room, Master Sergeant Owen Briggs had gone completely still. The color drained slowly from his face as he stared at the old man in the wheelchair. His eyes moved from Walter to the memorial wall and back again. The coffee cup in his hand slipped slightly against his fingers. A single drop splashed onto the concrete floor beneath him. Briggs barely noticed. Because somewhere deep in the oldest corners of military history, buried beneath decades of classified reports and quiet funerals, there was only one man who had ever used that call sign. The silence inside the operations lounge thickened like heavy fog rolling across cold water. Nobody laughed now. Nobody moved. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed looked around the room with growing confusion as faces that had been smirking only seconds earlier slowly lost their color. One operator near the coffee station quietly stood up from his chair without realizing he had done it. Another lowered his eyes toward the floor as though he had suddenly remembered something unpleasant from long ago. Mason frowned. "What?" he asked, forcing out an uneasy chuckle. "What is everybody looking at?" No one answered him. Master Sergeant Owen Briggs stared at Walter Hayes with the rigid stillness of a man, trying to convince himself he had heard wrong. The old veteran sat motionless beneath the pale overhead lights, one weathered hand resting against the wheel of his chair while rain streaked softly against the windows behind him. The low mechanical hum of the building suddenly felt louder than before. Briggs slowly set his coffee cup down on the nearest table. His pulse had begun hammering hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. Titan 3. The name had not been spoken aloud inside this building in decades. Not officially. Not casually. Certainly not by an old man wearing a faded field jacket and sitting alone in a wheelchair. Briggs had first heard the call sign 22 years earlier during selection. One of the instructors, a gray-haired operator missing 2 fingers on his left hand, had mentioned it once during a midnight briefing after too much whiskey. Just one sentence. "If you ever hear that call sign from a real source," the old instructor had said quietly, "you shut your mouth and stand up." Nobody had explained further. Nobody needed to. The legends surrounding the name had spread through the special operations community like ghost stories whispered between deployments. Some claimed Titan III had led extraction missions so classified they officially never happened. Others swore he had vanished during an Operation High in the Hindu Kush before most of the younger operators in this room had even finished high school. There were rumors of a helicopter crash, rumors of a mountain pass buried under snow, rumors of an entire team that survived because one man refused to leave them behind. But no confirmed records existed anywhere accessible below top-secret clearance. Mason Reed looked back toward Walter with narrowed eyes. "All right," he said carefully. "Cute story." His voice no longer carried the same swagger as before. "Who told you that name?" Walter did not answer. He simply kept staring toward the memorial wall where rows of old call signs rested beneath dim, recessed lighting. The room seemed colder now. Briggs stepped forward slowly. "Sir," he asked quietly, "where did you hear that call sign?" Walter finally turned his head toward him. The older operator immediately noticed something unsettling in the veteran's expression. No pride, no attempt to impress anyone, just exhaustion, deep and ancient, like a man carrying memories too heavy to explain. Walter's eyes drifted briefly toward the brass plaque mounted near the center of the wall. Daniel Mercer. Briggs followed the glance and felt his stomach tighten. Mercer had disappeared during Operation Night Lantern in 1987. The mission had remained classified for almost 4 decades. Almost nobody outside certain command circles even knew the operation existed. Mason folded his arms tightly. "Hold on," he said. "You are telling me this guy somehow knows classified Delta history?" One of the younger operators near the back muttered under his breath, "No civilian should know that name." Walter inhaled slowly. Outside, thunder rolled faintly over the flight line. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, a Black Hawk helicopter lifted into the storm-dark evening sky, its rotors thundering low through the rain. The sound drifted into the lounge like an echo from another lifetime. Walter closed his eyes for half a second. Rotor wash. Snow cutting sideways through darkness. Red emergency lights flickering across frozen rock. A radio voice breaking apart through static. "Titan III, do you copy?" The memory vanished as quickly as it came. Briggs made his decision. Without another word, he turned and walked briskly toward the secure hallway leading deeper into the command wing. Mason called after him. "Master Sergeant, where are you going?" Briggs did not stop. He only answered once as he disappeared through the reinforced security door. "To find out if we just insulted a ghost." The reinforced security door closed behind Master Sergeant Owen Briggs with a heavy metallic thud that echoed down the narrow hallway. He moved fast now, boots striking polished concrete beneath the cold white lights of Fort Liberty's command wing. The calm discipline drilled into him over 26 years of service was beginning to crack under the weight pressing against his chest. Titan III. Even thinking the name felt dangerous. Briggs passed rows of secured offices and encrypted communications rooms humming quietly behind thick steel doors. Rain battered the narrow windows overlooking the flight line outside, where blurred runway lights shimmered against the storm-dark evening. Somewhere beyond the concrete walls, another helicopter lifted into the air with a deep rhythmic pulse that vibrated faintly through the floor beneath him. He reached the end of the corridor and stopped at a black reinforced door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." A young communications specialist glanced up from behind the desk inside the control room. "Master Sergeant?" Briggs ignored the question. "I need secure command access. Right now." The specialist blinked at the tension in his voice and immediately reached for the authentication terminal. 30 seconds later, Briggs stood alone inside a compact secure communications booth barely large enough for one desk and a monitor. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed softly while encrypted systems warmed to life around him. His reflection stared back from the dark monitor glass for a brief moment. Older than he remembered. More tired. Briggs entered a clearance code with steady fingers that did not match the pulse hammering behind his ribs. The secure line connected with a burst of static. Then silence. Finally a voice answered. Calm. Sharp. Dangerous. Command operations. Briggs swallowed once. "This is Master Sergeant Owen Briggs, Delta Task Group 7. I need immediate verification on a legacy call sign." A pause. "Proceed." Briggs glanced back toward the closed booth door as though he expected someone to be listening. Titan 3. Nothing answered him at first. Not static. Not breathing. Nothing. Then the voice on the secure line changed completely. The comm vanished. Repeat that. Briggs lowered his voice instinctively. An elderly disabled veteran just entered our operations lounge. He identified himself with the call sign Titan 3. Another silence followed, but this one felt different. Heavier. Somewhere far away on the other end of the encrypted network, Briggs could almost feel people suddenly stopping what they were doing. Papers freezing midair. Heads turning. Computer. Screens lighting up. The operator finally spoke again. Much slower this time. Describe the man. Briggs looked toward the rain-covered window beyond the booth. White male. Approximately 84 years old. Thin build. Pale blue eyes. Wheelchair. Worn green field jacket. The operator inhaled sharply through his teeth. Briggs heard muffled movement in the background now. Chair scraping. Voices speaking urgently but too distant to understand clearly. Stay where you are, the operator ordered. Do not allow that individual to leave the building. Briggs frowned. Who is he? No answer came immediately. Then another voice entered the line. Older. Colder. Carrying the unmistakable authority of high command. Master Sergeant Briggs. Briggs straightened instinctively. Sir. This is Lieutenant General Marcus Vale. Briggs felt his stomach tighten instantly. Very few men inside the military commanded silence the way Marcus Vale did. The general oversaw joint special operations command groups across multiple theaters. Men like Briggs did not casually receive direct calls from officers like him. Vale spoke quietly. Did the man identify himself willingly? Yes, sir. Did he say anything else? Briggs thought briefly. No, sir. Only the call sign. General Vale went silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried something Briggs had never heard from a four-star officer before. Unease. Master Sergeant, Vale said carefully, listen to me very closely. You are to treat that man with the highest level of respect until I arrive. Briggs blinked. You are coming here personally, sir? Immediately, Briggs stared at the secure terminal in disbelief. Outside the booth, thunder rolled low across the Carolina sky. Rain hammered harder against the command center windows now, turning the distant flight line into blurred streaks of white and gray. Vale's voice lowered even further. And Master Sergeant, yes, sir? The general paused. Do not ask him about Operation Night Lantern. Briggs felt cold spread slowly down his spine, because suddenly the old stories no longer sounded like legends at all. Back inside the operations lounge, the atmosphere had changed so completely that even the younger operators could feel it pressing down on them. Conversations had died. Coffee sat untouched on tables. The large digital mission board mounted against the far wall continued cycling through deployment schedules and weather data, but nobody was paying attention to it anymore. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed stood near Walter Hayes with his arms folded tightly across his chest, trying to hold on to the confidence that had come so easily only 20 minutes earlier. It was slipping now. The old man remained perfectly still in his wheelchair beneath the cold recessed lighting, his faded green jacket hanging loosely from narrow shoulders that looked too frail to carry the weight now settling over the room. Yet somehow, his quiet presence seemed larger than everyone around him. Mason glanced toward the secure hallway where Briggs had disappeared. This is ridiculous, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Some old guy says a random call sign, and everybody suddenly acts like the world is ending. Nobody laughed this time. Across the room, one of the older operators slowly closed his laptop and leaned back in silence. Another stared openly at Walter now, studying the old veteran's weathered face as though searching for confirmation of something he did not want to believe. Rain streaked down the windows overlooking the flight line outside, distorting the red taxiway lights into blurred rivers of color. The storm had grown heavier. Thunder rolled faintly over Fort Liberty, while distant helicopter rotors pulsed low through the concrete structure like a heartbeat from another era. Walter barely noticed any of it. His eyes rested quietly on the memorial wall. Daniel Mercer. The brass letters reflected softly beneath the overhead lights. The name pulled at him like an old wound reopening beneath scar tissue. Then the room disappeared. The warm, recycled air of the operations lounge dissolved into freezing mountain wind cutting across exposed rock at 11,000 feet. Snow whipped sideways through darkness so thick it swallowed the world beyond 20 yards. Rotor blades thundered overhead somewhere beyond the storm, their sound broken apart by radio static and screaming crosswinds. Walter was young again, 25. Strong hands gripping a frozen radio handset while his team huddled against black stone deep inside a mountain pass no map officially acknowledged. Frost coated the edges of his gloves. His breathing fogged inside the darkness beneath a camouflage hood soaked with snow and aviation fuel. Around him, exhausted operators fought to stay awake after nearly 30 hours trapped above the tree line. One of them leaned against the rock wall nearby, pale from altitude sickness and exposure. Another stared silently down the mountain through night vision lenses coated in ice. The radio crackled violently in Walter's ear. Titan 3, extraction window closing. Repeat, extraction window closing. Walter looked toward the sky where dim navigation lights flickered faintly through the blizzard. A helicopter trying to hold position against impossible wind. He remembered the sound most clearly. Not fear, not shouting. Just the relentless roar of rotor wash hammering snow and gravel against the mountainside, while men trusted him with their lives because there was nobody else left to trust. Another voice crackled through the radio. Younger, panicked despite every effort to hide it. We are not going to make it off this ridge. Walter remembered answering without emotion. Calm, steady. You stay on your feet. Snow stung his face as he moved toward the landing zone marker buried beneath ice and rock. The mountain wind screamed louder around him. Then the memory vanished. Walter blinked once, and the operations lounge returned around him. Warm lights, concrete walls, coffee and machine oil in the air. Across the room, Mason Reed shifted uneasily under the old veteran's distant stare. For the first time since this began, the younger operator felt something cold settle deep in his stomach. Not fear exactly. Something worse. The realization that the man sitting quietly in front of him had once lived through places Mason could barely imagine. A secure door hissed open down the hallway. Heads turned instantly. Master Sergeant Owen Briggs stepped back into the lounge, his face pale and rigid. He stopped just inside the room and looked directly at Walter Hayes. Then, without saying a single word, Briggs slowly straightened his posture and came to full attention. The movement was so sudden that several younger operators instinctively straightened in response before they even understood why. Master Sergeant Owen Briggs stood rigid near the entrance to the operations lounge, boots together, shoulders squared, eyes locked directly on Walter Hayes. The room froze around him. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed stared openly now, confusion spreading across his face as he watched one of the most respected senior operators on base standing at full attention for an old man in a wheelchair. Nobody spoke. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence while rain hammered against the windows overlooking the darkened flight line outside. Briggs swallowed once before speaking. "Sir," he said quietly. The single word landed heavier than any shout could have. Mason blinked. "Wait," he muttered. "What are you doing?" Briggs did not look at him. Standing where I should have the moment, he entered the room. The younger operators exchanged uneasy glances. One slowly rose from his chair without realizing it. Another lowered his eyes toward the floor. The atmosphere inside the lounge no longer felt casual or even military. It felt sacred. Walter Hayes looked up at Briggs with the same calm expression he had carried since arriving at Fort Liberty. His pale blue eyes reflected the cold recessed lights overhead, while the storm outside deepened into rolling thunder and streaks of rain across the glass. "At ease, Master Sergeant," Walter said softly. Briggs hesitated before relaxing slightly, though he remained standing straight. "General Vale is on his way here personally," he said. A visible ripple moved through the room. Even the youngest operators understood what that meant. Four-star generals did not abandon command briefings to visit waiting lounges during thunderstorms. Mason stared at Briggs in disbelief. "You actually called command over this?" Briggs finally turned toward him. The look in his eyes stripped away every remaining trace of arrogance from the younger operator's face. "You have no idea who you are talking to." Mason opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Briggs walked slowly toward Walter's wheelchair and stopped beside him. Up close, the old veteran looked even more ordinary. Thin hands, wrinkled skin, a worn green jacket faded by decades of weather and time. The steel cane clipped beside the chair carried scratches polished smooth from years of use. Yet Briggs noticed something else now. Stitched carefully onto the inside collar of Walter's jacket was an old faded patch almost hidden beneath the fabric fold. No insignia, no unit marking, just a black embroidered triangle with a single silver line running through its center. Briggs felt cold move through him again. He had seen that symbol only once before inside a restricted archive briefing almost 15 years earlier. Operation Night Lantern. The files had contained almost no photographs, no detailed records, just fragmented mission reports and heavily redacted after-action summaries describing impossible weather conditions high in the mountains near the Afghan border during the winter of 1987. One line from the report still lived in Briggs's memory. Extraction succeeded under command of Titan III. Nothing else explained how. Nothing explained why nearly every operator involved in the mission later disappeared into classified reassignment programs or quiet retirement. Briggs lowered his voice carefully. "Sir," he asked, "why come here after all these years?" Walter remained silent for several moments. The storm outside rumbled low across the Carolina sky. Somewhere on the flight line, warning lights blinked through sheets of rain, while distant maintenance crews hurried beneath the thunder of idling helicopters. Finally, Walter looked back toward the memorial wall. His eyes settled once more on Daniel Mercer's brass nameplate. "Mercer used to hate storms," he said quietly. The room listened without breathing. Walter's voice carried no drama, only memory. Said mountain storms sounded like the sky trying to tear itself apart. Briggs felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Mason looked between them both now, no longer. Seeing an old disabled veteran, he was beginning to understand that the quiet man sitting in front of him carried the weight of entire histories nobody in this room had ever been taught. Walter's weathered fingers rested lightly against the armrest of his wheelchair. "I promised him once," he said softly, "that if I was still alive when they finally put his name on that wall, I would come see it myself." Silence settled over the operations lounge again. Heavy, absolute. Then, from somewhere deep beyond the secure hallway, came the sharp echo of approaching footsteps moving fast. The footsteps grew louder with astonishing speed. Hard soles striking concrete in sharp, controlled rhythm somewhere beyond the secured hallway. Every operator inside the lounge turned instinctively toward the sound. Staff Sergeant Mason Reed felt tension coil through the room like static before lightning. Nobody spoke now. Nobody dared. Even the storm outside seemed distant compared to whatever was moving toward them through the command wing. Then the reinforced security doors swung open. 2 military police officers entered first, stepping aside immediately as a tall figure in dark service uniform strode through behind them with purposeful speed. Lieutenant General Marcus Vale carried the kind of presence that silenced rooms long before he ever spoke. Silver stars gleamed beneath the harsh overhead lighting, while rainwater darkened the shoulders of his overcoat from the sprint across the flight line. He was nearly 60 years old, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, his expression carved from decades of command decisions few men could survive making. Every operator in the lounge snapped instantly to attention. Chairs scraped backward across the concrete floor. Coffee cups were abandoned untouched. Mason Reed straightened so quickly his shoulders struck the edge of a nearby table. "Room, attention!" Briggs barked unnecessarily. General Vale ignored everyone except one person. Walter Hayes remained seated quietly beside the memorial wall, pale blue eyes lifting calmly toward the approaching general. For a brief moment, the entire operations lounge held perfectly still beneath the fluorescent lights and rolling thunder outside. Vale stopped 3 feet in front of the wheelchair. His jaw tightened visibly. The powerful 4-star officer who commanded thousands of elite personnel across multiple theaters suddenly looked far older than before. Not weaker, just heavier somehow. Like a man staring directly into a memory he had spent years trying to bury. Walter studied him quietly. "Marcus," he said softly. The use of the first name sent visible shock through several operators nearby. Mason Reed stared openly now, unable to process what he was witnessing. Nobody addressed Marcus Vale that way. Nobody. Yet the general showed no anger at all. Instead, his eyes lowered briefly toward the faded field jacket, the steel cane clipped beside the wheelchair, the old hands resting calmly against worn armrests. Then General Vale did something nobody inside the room expected. He removed his gloves slowly, carefully, one finger at a time. The room remained utterly silent except for rain hammering against the windows overlooking the dark Carolina flight line. Vale stepped forward and reached out with both hands. Walter met him halfway. The handshake lasted only seconds, but every operator in the room felt the weight behind it. Respect. Grief. History. General Vale lowered his head slightly. "We thought you were dead," he said quietly. Walter gave the faintest shrug. "Almost was." No one moved. No one breathed loudly enough to break the moment. Mason Reed watched the exchange with growing disbelief. The same old man he had mocked less than an hour earlier was now being greeted by one of the most powerful generals in the United States military, as though he were something far beyond rank. Vale finally looked around the operations lounge. His eyes swept across every stunned operator standing rigid beneath the overhead lights. "Who questioned him?" he asked calmly. The question landed harder than any shouted accusation. Nobody answered immediately. Mason felt heat crawl slowly into his face. Briggs glanced toward him once, but said nothing. Mason swallowed hard before stepping forward. "Sir, I did." Vale studied him for several long seconds. The younger operator suddenly understood exactly how small he truly was inside this room. Not because of rank, because of history. Vale turned back toward Walter. "Sir," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology on behalf of every person in this building." Walter looked toward the memorial wall again. Daniel Mercer's name reflected softly beneath the lights. "No," he said quietly. "You do not." The general frowned slightly. Walter's pale eyes never left the brass plaque. "Most of these boys were not even born yet," he continued softly. "How could they know?" Thunder rolled low outside, while rain streaked across the glass in silver rivers. The operations lounge remained silent beneath the weight of his words. Then General Vale looked back toward the operators one final time. "You men spend your careers studying legends," he said quietly. "Tonight one of them rolled through your front door in a wheelchair, and half this room laughed at him." No one in the operations lounge dared move after General Vale finished speaking. The storm outside rolled heavily across Fort Liberty now, rattling rain against the reinforced windows, while distant runway lights shimmered through sheets of water like blurred stars. Every operator remained standing beneath the fluorescent lights, rigid with the uncomfortable realization that history had just walked quietly into the room, wearing a faded green jacket and pushing worn rubber wheels across polished concrete. Walter Hayes looked tired now. Not weak, just exhausted in the way only very old soldiers ever looked. The kind of exhaustion that settled into the bones after carrying memories for too many decades. General Vale slowly stepped beside the wheelchair and glanced toward the memorial wall where Daniel Mercer's name rested among dozens of others. "They finally added him 6 months ago," Vale said quietly. Walter nodded once. "Long time coming." Vale exhaled softly through his nose. A lot of things from that mission stayed buried longer than they should have. Across the room, Mason Reed remained frozen beside the operations table. His face had lost all color. Every moment from earlier replayed through his mind now with crushing clarity. The jokes, the smirks, the arrogance in his own voice when he had mocked the old man sitting quietly in front of him. He felt sick remembering it. Briggs stepped closer to the memorial wall and studied Walter carefully. "Sir," he asked softly, "is it true?" Walter glanced toward him. "Which part?" Briggs hesitated. "The extraction on Night Lantern. The mountain pass." Silence settled briefly over the room again. Walter's eyes drifted back toward the brass nameplate beneath the soft overhead light. Thunder rolled low outside. Then the old veteran gave the faintest nod. "Weather collapsed faster than command predicted," he said quietly. His voice remained calm, matter of fact, like a man discussing old machinery instead of history whispered about for decades. Snow buried the northern ridge before sunrise. Radios froze. Navigation failed. We lost visual on the landing zone twice. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody would have dared. Walter's gaze remained fixed on Mercer's name. Mercer wanted to pull the team back down the mountain. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Smart man. Smarter than me." General Vale lowered his eyes briefly. Walter continued softly. "But we still had operators stranded above the ridge line. Rain hammered harder against the windows. The distant pulse of helicopter rotors drifted through the storm-dark evening outside. Somewhere deep in the building, radios crackled faintly before falling silent again. Walter's voice grew quieter now, almost lost beneath the sound of rain. Pilot said he could not hold position more than 30 seconds in that wind. Mason listened without breathing. He could almost see it now. Black sky, frozen mountains, rotor wash scattering snow into darkness, while men trusted each other with their lives in places the world would never know existed. Walter finally looked toward the younger operators standing silently around the room. "Those boys up there were barely older than you are now," he said softly. "Cold changes a man fast." Nobody moved. Briggs swallowed hard. "Sir, the report said only 5 men made it off that mountain." Walter nodded once. "That is correct." Briggs frowned slightly. "But the manifest listed 6 operators." Walter's expression did not change. He slowly lifted one weathered hand and pointed toward Daniel Mercer's brass nameplate on the wall. The room understood instantly. A deep silence settled over the operations lounge beneath the storm outside. General Vale closed his eyes briefly. Mason Reed stared at the memorial wall as guilt tightened in his chest. The name suddenly felt real now. Not brass, not history, a person. Walter rested his hand back against the wheelchair armrest. "Mercer stayed behind to guide the helicopter through the pass," he said quietly. Visibility was almost gone. His pale blue eyes reflected the overhead lights as memory passed silently across his face once more. "Last thing I heard over the radio was him laughing about how much he hated mountain storms." Nobody in the room spoke after that, because for the first time, every operator standing there finally understood what separated legends from ordinary men. It was not strength. It was not rank. It was the quiet willingness to carry ghosts for 40 years without asking the world for recognition. The operations lounge remained silent long after Walter Hayes stopped speaking. Rain rolled steadily against the reinforced windows overlooking the flight line, while distant runway lights flickered through the storm like fading embers. Nobody shifted. Nobody checked a phone or glanced toward a monitor. The entire room stood trapped inside the gravity of a story most of them had never known existed. General Marcus Vale slowly stepped beside the memorial wall and looked up at Daniel Mercer's brass nameplate. The 4-star officer's reflection shimmered faintly against the polished black surface beneath the overhead lights. "Mercer saved 23 operators during his career," Vale said quietly. "But every classified report I ever read about Night Lantern said the mission only succeeded because one man refused to abandon the mountain." Walter lowered his eyes slightly. "That is not how Mercer told it." A faint smile touched Vale's face for the first time all evening. "No," he admitted softly. "It never was." Staff Sergeant Mason Reed stood motionless near the operations table, the weight of embarrassment pressing harder into him with every passing minute. He looked again toward the old wheelchair beside the memorial wall. The faded green jacket, the scarred hands, the steel cane worn smooth with age. Nothing about Walter Hayes matched the image Mason had carried his entire life about what legends were supposed to look like. He had imagined strength as loud confidence, physical dominance, sharp uniforms and polished records. Not silence, not humility, not an old man quietly honoring a promise 40 years overdue. Mason swallowed hard before finally stepping forward. His boots echoed softly across the concrete floor. Several operators glanced toward him as he approached Walter slowly. For the first time since the encounter began, Mason's voice carried no arrogance at all. "Sir," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Walter looked up at him calmly. Mason forced himself to continue despite the knot tightening in his chest. "I thought." He stopped briefly, searching for words that suddenly felt too small. "I thought you were just some lost old veteran." Walter studied him for several seconds. Then the old man gave the faintest nod. "Most of us are eventually." The answer hit harder than any reprimand ever could. Mason lowered his eyes briefly, ashamed now not only of his words, but of how quickly he had judged someone whose entire life carried more weight than his own career ever might. General Vale looked around the operations lounge once more. Every operator still stood silently beneath the storm-dark lights of Fort Liberty. "Remember this moment," the general said quietly, "because one day all of us end up where he is now." Nobody interrupted him. Vale's voice remained calm. "Steady. The uniform comes off. The missions end. The body gets old. And eventually the only thing a soldier truly keeps is whether he honored the men beside him." Thunder rolled low outside, while rain streaked silver across the windows overlooking the runway. Walter turned his wheelchair slightly toward the memorial wall one final time. His pale blue eyes rested quietly on Daniel Mercer's name beneath the soft recessed lights. The room watched him in silence. After several long seconds, Walter reached into the inside pocket of his faded jacket and removed a small object wrapped carefully in worn cloth. His hands moved slowly as he unfolded it. Inside rested an old tarnished military challenge coin scratched by decades of use. One side carried the faded insignia from a unit no longer officially acknowledged. The other side bore a single engraved phrase, "Never leave the ridge." Walter stared at it quietly before placing the coin beneath Mercer's brass nameplate. The sound it made against the polished wall was soft, almost delicate. Yet inside the silent operations lounge, it echoed like something permanent. Walter rested his hands back on the wheelchair armrests and exhaled slowly. Outside, the storm finally began drifting east across the Carolina sky. The rain softened. The distant roar of helicopter rotors faded gradually into the night. General Vale stood silently beside the old veteran while every operator in the room remained motionless beneath the overhead lights. And somewhere deep inside themselves, each of them understood the same truth at once. The deadliest men were rarely the loudest, and the greatest soldiers often looked exactly like someone the world had forgotten.